colleague Kwekwa Asante interacting with some of the members of parliament, and what even caught my attention most is the minister in charge of trade, agribusiness and industry, Elizabeth Ofusojari, who actually makes up the cabinet. One of the few women that made it to cabinet, which minority leader has been talking about because they constitute only 10%. But the president has been assuring us that a little over 23% constitute women in his government currently. He also touched briefly on the affirmative action law, and we're going to be discussing a lot better how we can drill this down and how we can decentralize women in better positions. But we're still in the studio with Dennis Asari, but I'm going to go on Zoom, blessed, and let's engage Dr. Victor Benu-Yena, and we want to understand, because you are an economist, that this State of the Nation's address that has been delivered by the president today, just opposing it with the previous ones, especially the very last one in January, does this really reflect the true state of the economy, or it's just, you know, a campaign message that has been repackaged, given assurances?
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, I study labor economics, but I'm not the old traditional economist. First of all, I'd like to commend the president for speaking with grace and such precision. Although I haven't seen much in terms of substance, and I haven't seen a lot in terms of his point of reference. So when you tackle very difficult issues, as the case is in Ghana, I would expect that the mechanism that he puts in place to tackle the issues in Ghana are extraordinary. I have not seen extraordinary measures in his speech, but I forgive him, because this could just be State of the Nation address rather than a budget. If it were a budget, I would have been quite worried for the future of Ghana. He has mentioned a number of things, anchoring all of his points around the 24-hour economy. There is no such thing as 24-hour economy. I would like to sort of make that very clear. There are 24-hour cities in different countries: Dubai, New York, London, Madrid, Barcelona, just to name a few. These are cities and essentially anchored around services and tourism. Unless and until the Ghana government sees things in this light, the idea of having 24-hour economy is just an idea, and it's never going to be a plan that will take the nation forward. Why do people come to Dubai 24 hours around the clock? They come because the tourism infrastructure is in place, the road network is in place, the trains are working, the flights never get delayed as much as possible. We do not currently have a national carrier in Ghana. How could you possibly talk about 24-hour city or economy when there is no national carrier? Rwanda has got one. Uganda recently has got a fleet of aircraft. And I traveled in one of them. Splendid achievement for the Ugandan government, although we would not normally want to compare ourselves with them. So I think, although the president has a good idea to take the nation from where it is at the moment to where he would like it to be, and I speak purely from economic and developmental position rather than political position, I think extraordinary measures need to be taken into account to take the country forward. Think of South Korea, think of Singapore, Malaysia, United Arab Emirates, Rwanda in Africa, so that I do not seem to be excluding countries in Africa. They have done all the things I've just mentioned a few seconds ago. So I'm quite troubled that if I were to ask my master's level students to write a speech on a nation like Ghana, they would come up with a story like what we have heard today.
Yeah, but Doc, when you make these points, yeah, but Doc, when you make these points, then Rwanda would be a one-off, isn't it? You're looking at an economy such as Ghana that is largely dominated by the informal sector. Our terminologies in terms of a 24-hour economy would not bother on issues of an air carrier and all of that. So if you're talking about a 24-hour economy in a developing nation such as Ghana, why tie it to a national carrier? It's far-fetched, isn't it?
Well, not actually, because if you describe 24-hour economy as an economy that has activities round the clock, what would come into mind? You think of restaurants, you think of taxi services working 24/7. You think of the transport system working 24/7. You think of airlines arriving both at dawn and at dusk. So without having those in place, how could you possibly? I cannot think of any country.
But my point is, this is largely an informal economy. The people trading, doing their businesses each and every day would not be thinking about what some would term as luxury. You're looking at the world, demographics in terms of number of people who've done flights before. They are way less than 10% of the world's population. So not everybody will be reliant on an air carrier. I'm saying that this is an informal economy. Why tie our version of the 24-hour economy to what London thinks, for instance, what's happening in Madrid when we're a developing nation? That's my question, sir.
Well, so there are other developing nations. Think of Zanzibar. Why is it a 24-hour city or country? Because tourists fly externally to that country. So you have positioned this or sort of oversimplified in terms of outward travel, people traveling outside of Ghana. I'm looking at it as bringing people from outside the country into the country. And by no means this is a criticism. I'm trying to say that there's a better way to take the 24-hour economy to the next level that is achievable and also beneficial to the country. So coming back to your question, essentially it's a developing country. Why not bring tourists to the country? Why not develop the sector? We have a very enviable coastline in Ghana. We have tourism sector. I know Kakun Forest, we've mentioned Paga and some other resources in Ghana. Why not develop that further so that attracts foreign tourists to come to the country? That's my point. 24, if I go back to your point, developing economy with informal sector, how then would the president argue for a 24-hour economy when it's largely informal economy?
Yeah, but the data is still clear on that. The service sector appears to be leading in terms of our breakdown when you look at that sector as well. So it's not as though it's out of a vacuum that you would want to call for a 24-hour economy when, of course, the service sector would not perform or render services beyond 12 hours, or be beyond midnight, if I should say.
Why not? If you bring in tourists, they will be in the restaurants.
Okay, maybe this is what we'll do. Let's bring in Professor Lord Mensah as well. And I get your point clearly, but I'm just raising these issues also because of the challenge we're suffering from the NDC. They've not provided us with a clear explanation as to what this 24-hour economy is about. And I get your point on the issues that you're raising.
And that's exactly why I think this position. Let's look at other countries in the world as reference points.
But that's where I want us to depart from, because this is Ghana. Professor Lord Mensah, let me hear from you. The point about being a sovereign nation, having our own unique challenges, we're still developing, and that's the point I'm reinforcing. I don't know what your take will be on the 24-hour economy and making it unique to the informal sector, because these are the people who are bringing the votes to the NDC as well, isn't it?
You're very right. I'm sorry for joining you late. You see, the 24-hour economy that we're looking at, we may have to situate it in our own context, not necessarily looking at an advanced world type of 25. But if you listen to we are proud of the elections, if you listen to the series of symposiums that held of the 24-hour economy, clearly it came out that government needs to involve the private sector. Government has to make sure that they provide certain basic amenities, looking at security, looking at making sure that the light is on for 24 hours, and ensuring that anyone that intends to trade or wants to go into an economic activity in the night will be secured. Okay? And again, also looking at identifying certain hubs within the country. If you look at, for instance, Cantamanto, right, where during the day you see all the cars penetrating one point within Accra, trying to make sure that they offload goods here and there. You provide something like Flag-a-Light, right, for Cantonment, which is the typical informal sector hub, right, for our economy. You provide something like Flag-a-Light. They should be able to work during the night and then ease one way or the other traffic during the day. So, it's a matter of identifying what, we have already and then also improving on it. For instance, when you take a place like Ridge Hospital, it is a formal sector. But then in the end, we have borrowed, funds for such, facility. We are operating it less than, 12 hours in a day. We try to do some night shift, but because it has not been sanctioned by government, when you go there in the night, you don't see vibrant, health activities going on there. But then if we activate it as a sort of, policy, right, you're going to have same workforce you have in the day. I mean, having the same workforce in the night. I mean, one way or the other can create jobs. Now, we have to understand that as a country like Ghana, we have borrowed for some time. Now, these funds that we borrowed came into the country to operate, to put up infrastructure. Go to UGMC. UGMC is a huge edifice that we can put up, 24-hour economy on it, 24-hour activity on it to generate more for the government. But we are operating it for, just 8 hours. If we can stretch it, we're looking at, 12 hours. So from where I sit, we have borrowed up to a point. Now we've been blocked from the financial market. We cannot, go all out to say we want to own our own air carrier that will bring in tourists here and there. We have to make sure we activate local patronage, our own economy, before we start thinking about, extending it to the outside world. So,
Prof, indulge me a bit.
We need to start from what we have.
Absolutely, Prof. And so, and again, it looks like we're staying on the conversation of 24 hours economy because that's what's, at the center of the conversation. But at the heart of economy, really, is demand and supply. Are we in any way suggesting that in this country, there's high demand for a certain level of supply, which is why we think we should run a 24-hour economy? Let's get that clarity.
Let's be careful how we talk about demand and supply here. A country that imports, right, that has been importing, we cannot talk about not having demand. You realize that we generate, right, but it's not enough. And you will see, if you go into our import bill, you will see a lot of items that we can produce here that at the end of the day we import them. So how can we say there's no demand?
And must it be for the 24 hours? Is that what it means?
Yes, because necessarily, because we've been underutilizing some of the structures that we have, that is why probably we are not able to produce to the tune of meeting the demand that we have to sometimes extend it by importing. It's a matter of, understanding and then going through our import bill to know what we need to produce here and by extending the time of operation. So from where I sit, we cannot say there's no demand. In fact, Ghana, if I identify all the products that we produce in Ghana, I cannot say that any of them has produced to saturate the Ghanaian market.
Right.
I can't be comfortable with that.
Prof, will you handle that for us, and then we'll go to Austin Gami, and then we like your company in the studio.
And I understand you. So by then we have to make sure that at least we use what we have. We utilize what we have.
Okay, do stay with us.
Government must make sure that they involve the private sector.
Okay.
Otherwise, government cannot own it as a policy and run it through. It's going to be the usual policies that governments of the day come and they roll it out. But once, the economic structure is able to, be in tune with the private sector, interest rates are coming down, stability in inflation and all those. We're going to have an economy that can help, have this 24 hours.
Right. Austin Gami is labor expert, and Blessed, the heart of this again in 24-hour economy would be labor.
I was just going to point out to that because clearly if you look at what's happening in the public sector and the bailout plan with the International Monetary Fund, clearly there's absolutely no way that the government would have the luxury to pile up the numbers. And that's why we've seen this mass, if you want to call it, revocation of the appointments directive coming through from the Chief of Staff, raising a number of questions as to what really the government's plan is in terms of job creation. 24-hour economy, yes, will be government's grand plan, because then if you're able to open up the service sector, increase the hours of rendering the services, then you can rule on quite a number of people. But then you have the public sector, and Austin Gami, this is where I want to bring you in, the public sector reeling under, first of all, a bloated list. The IMF and other international partners have spoken about this over the years. But in our case, well, we are still piling up the numbers. The government, then a new government comes, they revoke the appointments, and then it becomes politics. That's where we find ourselves. But is it not of interest to you that the president himself did not speak about this thorny issue during the State of the Nation address today?
Thank you. I think he really did well by not engaging himself about that particular concern raised by unions. That is a matter that can be discussed at another level and not at the State of the Nation address. So I applaud him for not addressing it, because
you have potentially 10,000 people going home. You feel that's not part of the State of the Nation?
Yeah, it shouldn't be. You know, there is always an optimum level beyond which you cannot go. Any company or any organization, whether public or private, that employs one person more than the allowable number, you are not a good manager. You are bankrupting the system. And so we should not, under any circumstance, attempt to say that then it's like, let's open the floodgate, let's employ everybody that is unemployed in Ghana in the public sector. It's not possible. So I think that it is clearly unfair for people to be pressurizing the president and the system to employ people who are not essentially required. You know, like the nurses, like maybe the teachers, like the lab people, anybody at all.
If your word is essential, that will be questionable. The nurses to teacher, the nurses to patient ratio were under by some 200 percentage points, going by the World Health Organization standard. One patient to about 400 medics. That's the situation now. In terms of teachers, 1:14. So there's a huge demand for these people. Yet we're sending some of them back home.
Yeah, certainly we cannot address those things in one day. And if you do that, you strangulate your economy, you create problem, and you'll be back to square one. Already Ghana is about 60 years behind. So we cannot afford to be adding such kind of misbehaviors to it again. Now the point is that everything said by the president today is a function, the function of the economy will accommodate it. If the economy is not functioning well, everything said there cannot be accommodated. And therefore must be clearly understood by all of us that it's not about propounding things and theories and so forth and so on. Practically, we must ensure that we add value to the structures that we have. Like the 24-hour economy that is being talked about, I am a big fan of it and a teacher of it. And I can tell you on authority that without that, and if it's done well, we will not come and sit here and be talking about unemployment in this country anymore. We will have reasonable number of people who are willing to work will be put to work. And so the structures that we have to make full use of it. It appears we have lived with this kind of lackadaisical approach to things, and he has promised that he would like to fix the economy. Let's work together with him to set up Ghana as we want it to be.
Okay.
And MF, I was just bringing you up to speed with that when the president was speaking. My thoughts on inclusivity in job creation, the side about women. Even if you look at the ministerial appointments, they are jobs, whether we like it or not, MF. But the women are not featuring as much.
Oh, well, Dennis, let's see. And we'll come back to you, Austin, because then again, he mentioned the 10% base pay. Now, my concern is at the time that it was implemented or increased, or the agreement or the contract that was signed at the time that it was done, was it timely? Was it a conducive time, especially because they're just taking up government? And I know that conversation has been nagging at every government anytime they come to power. At the time that this 10% base increase was done, was it necessary? Was it important? Could we have shifted a little further? But Dennis, so the minority addressing as right after the State of the Nation's address says that this government in the last 50 days have borrowed how much? 59 billion from the Treasury. And was this, I know that they said there's no money, but was this needed, especially at this time? And what do you think really they're using this money for?
MFI, if you look at the current state of our economy, what we're experiencing is that we don't have sufficient revenue. We've been locked out of the international capital market. The only means of, let's say, money for the government is the domestic market. And so this borrowing has been strictly from the short-term treasury market. And so these monies were borrowed from the treasury market to shore up our revenues, because revenues are not enough to meet our obligations. And so whilst the government is making effort or planning to roll out a lot of revenue mobilization mechanisms, their only avenue to raise money is the domestic market. And that is what they need to meet their government obligations between now to when revenues start coming in. Mind you, just when they took over power, we didn't have sufficient fuel. Just when they took over power, there have been some obligations that government had to meet. Remember that they had to settle some debt for the domestic the domestic debt exchange program. Those that we owe, they had to settle that as well. Then also there are other obligations that government had to meet with paying some outstanding arrears and all of that. Government is also planning to build some buffers ahead of the debt that we are going to pay somewhere in July. All of these monies will have to come from our domestic market. And so all this borrowing comes from the domestic market. Remember that the government is also planning that they also want to enter the domestic bond market again. So within the short term, that is the most easiest avenue for raising money to finance our obligations and ahead of any other revenue mobilization.
But MFA, all of this is coming up simply because it's like a spiral, isn't it? What Dr. Stephen Amwa was speaking of earlier about the health of the economy itself. And Professor Lord Mensah is also with us. Prof, the point about, getting back to pre-COVID levels. MFA, we've heard that.
What does that even mean?
Yeah, but well, looking at the data, I mean, give the NDCs, the NPP some credit. In terms of the number, Prof, we are back to pre-COVID level, but probably not as much as the 2019 GDP growth.
I don't want to be complacent on the short-term gains that we've achieved, but we compromise the long-term focus of rescuing this economy. You see, let me tell you one thing. You asked a question about whether the 59 billion that has been borrowed by the government is in order or not. We have a government that we're going to go through transition, and as a result of that, we had a budget that was read for the first quarter of the year. The question we need to ask is, has the government spent within that kind of budget that was given within the first quarter of the year? The answer is yes. But then how was it financed, the deficit financing, which is going to pay for the borrowed, the debt and all those? I mean, obviously it's going to be the domestic market. And for me, when we're talking about revenue, I don't want to add international market access. I don't think it's supposed to be a benchmark because it's like you're living in your house. I mean, the borrowing should be a last resort. You should always find a means of generating, domestically. If you have kind of ambitious project that you want to do, a project that can finance itself, then you look external by going to the bank to borrow or going to the international market to go and borrow. And by so doing, you should also appreciate that the project that you're going to put the money into should be able to generate forex. So if you borrowed $1, the international market, you should be able to feed into $1 investment that will generate $1 revenue in this country. So from where I sit, I think we may have to be careful when we are talking about the economic. Let me come back to your question, which has to do with whether we are in the pre-COVID level or not. Before COVID, were we financing solely from the domestic market using treasury bills? That is why I said we don't need to be complacent on the short-term gains that we've talked about. We've chopped and compromised the long-term focus of, getting the economy in order. Because if you look at the current state of the economy, trust me, anybody who is an economist, a serious economist, will be scared of the situation. An economy that your financing sources is limited to short term, what it tells you is that you cannot do any capital-intensive investment. Okay? Because the bond market is not there. And that is why government consistently has tried as much as possible to satisfy the debt obligations so that they can gradually whet the appetite of the investment community to medium term. and then build up into, long term. So we can raise money for roads, we can raise money for hospitals and other things. The question you need to ask yourself is, if you are talking about providing infrastructure, right, where would the money come from? Because long-term finance is long-term project. That is how it is. So from where I sit, we're never close to pre-COVID. And it's going to take us not less than 8 to 10 years to get to pre-COVID level. Because before the COVID, we had several sources of finance. We're looking at the Euro bond market. Cocoa board itself was bringing in money at the time. Now, cocoa board cannot go to the international market to raise even $2 billion, dollar inflows. Remember when we used to tame the exchange rate? We used to tame the exchange rate when we are expecting the Euro bond funds, when we are expecting, the cocoa board inflows. But now is it like that? So when the dollar starts easing itself upwards, trust me, the control measures is going to be a problem. So we shouldn't, compare the current economic situation with what we had pre-COVID. So, we have to be careful. We're nowhere near, and that's my answer to you.
And MFI, if you listen to the president, the theme that strikes through almost all of his statements about modest spending, probably that's his alternative in terms of checking the wastage within the system, and it brings to the fore issues about corruption, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's very true. Because if you have, you have a budget that you are limited in terms of your revenue generation, the only option for you is to cut down expenditure. But then it's unfortunate that the IMF program that we put ourselves in, the previous administration was emphasizing on revenue generation, without focusing so much on expenditure rationalization. Because, we're getting closer to elections, and it will be politically suicidal, to attempt to cut down some expenditure. But then I think, the current administration has some goodwill. Because if you look at the numbers that they chalked when it comes to the elections, it looks like the Ghanaian people were fed up to a certain level. And for me, they can take advantage of it now, right, to propose whatever austere measures that they can rescue the economy to the typical Ghanaian.
Yeah, and
otherwise,
expectations.
Trust me, it's going to be a difficult way to come out from the mess.
But here is a danger as well, and I want to hear from Dennis on this, MFA. The expectation is very high.
On corruption, you mean?
On corruption, and how the president will check it, because there's the aspect of recoveries. Recall the issue about oral, right? And the amounts, billions of dollars that they've mentioned to us as potentially figures that have gone into wrong pockets, right?
Yes.
So then is the point about recovery. Can we really recover all these amounts? And
whilst you're at it, Dennis, just to pose the posture, I mean, we're not sorcerers and palm readers, but you can tell when a president is giving assurances and also the results of these assurances that the ex-president Akufo-Addo and his assurances on fighting corruption, and today the State of the Nation's address with this current president and his previous behavior towards corruption, just opposing it, that who will you have some assurances?
That's a big trap, isn't it?
Yes, so, I'll try my best. I think that at the center of the president's message ahead of the elections was that some profligacy in our spending and our inability to control and live within our means has led us to where we are as an economy. But even more so, we have created some sort of a situation where a lot of people were benefiting out of the system, creating schemes to loot and make some money from us. And so his plan was that it is time that we put in some measures to recover and allow people to pay or punish corruption. And so he is doing that through the operation Recover All Loot. I think that we have to be very careful with the way we see the oral in terms of recoveries by distinguishing between the type of corruption we have in our country with other countries. In some countries, most of the corruption cases like Nigeria are embezzlement. And if it is embezzlement, you can easily track, trace, and recover. But where in our case, some of these corruptions issues are more state captured through private sector schemes presented as national interest, but not really national interest, but they are purely private sector interests. It becomes very difficult how you're saying that you're going to use the oral avenue to recover all of that, because some spendings would have been done, some actions would have been taken, and they would justify those actions taken with the payments that have been received. And so in that context, where a transaction has been undertaken or some actions or maybe activity has been done in the name of the state by doing some actions for the country, but right behind it, you see a lot of private sector interest. It is very difficult to use the oral to recover that. Let me give you an example. If you take the Auditor General's report, some of the embezzlement and improperly accounted for transactions can easily be traced and tracked. But if you look at the nature of corruption that we are seeing here, or we are seeing within our country, it is very difficult to see how the oral framework will be able to penetrate that structure of corruption, that scheme of private sector, public sector collusion to recover that. Again, if you look at the legal process that it takes to even complete one case and get to a point where you are able to prove that indeed there was embezzlement, misappropriation of funds, and some really corruption grant scheme have happened, it takes a longer time. And so that recovery in terms of the enthusiasm around the amount that we're expecting, that if you go through all the 2,000 cases, we should be thinking about some 20 billion. We have to hasten.
That's a significant amount.
Yeah, we have to hasten very slowly. Another point that I also want to make is that, let me cite an example, the Pualugu Dam. Some $12 million have been expended in the name of feasibility study. How do you want to use the oral framework to be a strategy for recovering the money when, to some extent, if the feasibility work has been done? A recent example is the Sky Train, where feasibility study of about $5 million has come up, and that there's investigation ongoing. Yeah. And so we have to hasten slowly, but I get the president that this is a major promise that he spoke about, that he's going to use the oral to recover all loot. But if you listen to the president carefully, most of the times where he used oral is referring to instances where people have either illegally or through some collusion purchased state property, taking over certain state assets without going through due process. In those instances, it is easy to recover that. But where if you look at the current corruption schemes that are happening, some of the transactions and wrongful appropriation of state funds, the scheme and the nature that they are happening, it becomes very difficult to use oral. I'm thinking, how would you use oral to address SML? How would you use oral to deal with county GVG? Or how, yeah.
Or agencies, and so maybe by this time, oral must have done its work at the collection at the collection level and handed over data, and then the Attorney General and other relevant bodies. But my question again, Dennis, is that do we cost all of these investigations?
Well, I think that because the president set up this committee as a fact-finding committee, I don't know how they
in fact, to the states, at least they did it pro bono.
But I think that right from that, it will be handed to the Attorney General's office. That's why the cases have been given to the Attorney General's office. And so it would be within the resources of the Attorney General. And remember, in his speech, he mentioned that he was going to set up an office within the presidency where people can call in to report corruption and all of that. But the point that Blessed maybe I have to make is that the nature of corruption in our country is changing. And so we shouldn't think simplistic frameworks like following, maybe gathering evidence.
I hold a different.
Yeah, Prof, I'll come to you shortly. Let him land and then. Yeah.
Okay.
It's an interesting.
I think that the level of state
Prof, just hold briefly,
and private sector public collusion, creating frameworks in the name of national interest, the shape and form that they take cannot be through simplistic frameworks like oral to use to recover that. And another point that I would want to make before maybe Prof comes in is also that there should be specific targets on oral. So far, they have about 2,000 cases. What is the outcome they are looking for by first year, by second year, by third year? Because if you don't have a specific target, and let's say at least 50% of these cases should have been prosecuted, and let's say 30% recovery should have been made, all of these cases will be followed up. We see investigations, and by 4 years,
and Dennis,
nothing really.
I totally agree with you. It's about expectations, isn't it? At the time the report was submitted to the president, the impression, Professor Lord Mensah, the impression given to us was the recoveries are way beyond even the bailout we're looking for from the IMF in terms of the amounts, right? $3 billion bailouts. The argument is even if you do the recoveries alone, We should be,
That if you can do all of the recoveries, Prof, whilst you're at it, that's right. If you can do, because you're potentially unable to recover all of it. And if you do the math...
We live in a country where we've been using English to pretend things, and, things have become, say, so easier and easier every now and then. Let me tell you, there are international benchmarks. If you're talking about SkyTrain, right, we know how much it will cost you to do a feasibility studies for SkyTrain. If you're talking about putting up Agenda 111, we know how much it will cost you to do a feasibility studies for Agenda 111. Now, if you are giving us estimate that has gone beyond, international standards, it tells me that you want to dupe the country. We don't have to twist and turn things. There are benchmarks we can use to follow. But then when you talk about the recovery, whether we'll be able to recover 100% what, was found by the oral team earlier on, I will tell you no. The answer is bluntly no. The reason being that if you talk about, the banking sector, how do they recover their loans? Most of the time, they don't recover 100%. But you see, there is always a hope when you recover, something than nothing. Let me put it that way. Because if you take, for instance, the 3 billion that we went, from IMF, out of it, relative to the 21 billion that has been sunk down the drain that we're trying to retrieve, that's about 14%. We're not saying we should get 50% of the, 21 billion, but something must be on the table. And then also the fact that the president has given that signal of going after, those who have, stashed money somewhere, it will send a signal to the incoming administration that you dare not go there. Because, if you want to leave it, then it means you are giving room for, such a thing to happen. And, we shouldn't look at it only in monetary terms. A signal that is sent, out there, that you will not be comfortable when you want to collude with the private sector. If you ask my good friend at the studio, Dennis has been saying, if you want to collude with the private sector, to dupe the country, you will not go free. Okay. And you won't be comfortable. Right, but I want to see, that signal, being, sent out there. And I think it should go a long way to help us.
I'm really scared that we're losing sight over this, because the president spoke about it in passing, except to say that the effects will be very telling. For the president to admit, first of all, that there are some international developments that may affect, for instance, aid. We need to talk about that whilst we talk about the economy as well. And Emma, we all know what's happening in the US. Let's bring in Dr. Benia on that, and then we'll get back to Prof and the others on this issue, because Emma, you recall the president started off the conversation in Germany, right?
Yes.
Where he says, okay, we know the US is cutting aid, but that's going to be telling on us. I've instructed the finance minister to, look for the alternatives.
In this 90 days.
90-day pause.
In this 90 days.
It's affecting health. We heard from the health minister himself, Kovina Minja-Kando. I was there at the event with the WHO when he said that we are hoping and praying that they don't cut off the...
Imagine a country living on hope and prayer, Dr. Benina. But
that's the challenge.
Let's hear your take on that. Health, a country that's not healthy is definitely poor. How are we going to be surviving? And let's just assume that this 90 days, after the 90 days, then the US will bring some respite. But in this 90 days, which is a lot of days when we're talking about health, what would you say about this?
So, unfortunately, I haven't got the full sight of that version of the speech. But in terms of a healthy population, I wrote a paper in 2014 about the same idea when I was working in Vietnam. And having traveled the world, I could argue strongly that a healthy population would always aid productivity. So I think that idea, if he or the government implements it, is going to be quite effective. I don't know specifically which areas of health issues there are in Ghana at the moment, if they are related to childhood diseases or sort of maternal health.
But in the speech of the president, it was clear that the HIV program, for instance, will be affected or impacted because of just a decision by one country to suspend aid to ours, right? That's where the challenge lies. For instance, and malaria as well.
So you did mention, President and Lord, you did mention earlier on over-dependence on external sources for help. And I do not believe that we have the capacity at the moment, largely in Africa, and particularly in Ghana, that we can stand on our feet to deal with some of these HIV issues. Now, let's be honest. The drivers for HIV infection are largely related to poverty. If people are resourced enough to have their own monies or have their own income in place, I believe some of the people wouldn't choose the path that leads to HIV infection, for example, or any form of disease at all. I can tell you one of the healthiest countries in the world is United Arab Emirates. And that's because when external labor force comes into the country, they are screened for HIV and, as a matter of fact, any other diseases that could bring the country's population to danger. So I don't believe that about 36 million people in Ghana would all have to be screened and dealt with in a way that will solve this problem. But the US aid, unfortunately, is no longer there. We can see what's happening in the United States. Donald Trump is not holding back. He's doing things that, excuse me to say, we should have been doing in Ghana. Well, cutting down government spending is great. And that money could go to aid HIV treatment, for example. We know from science that HIV is no longer killing people. If you stick to the AVR, I think it's called antiretroviral drugs, if you stick to them. But where do we get the money from to buy this medication for the population that need it the most? But I would rather not deal with the solution to the problem. I would rather deal with the preventive measures, which include development. And that's the first point that I made, that we need to really approach the issues in Ghana extraordinarily. What we are talking about today, we will revisit this 5 years from now, 10 years from now. We may have the same exact conversation. What is the extraordinary thing we need to do now as far as our health status in Ghana is concerned? What are the extraordinary things that we have to do today to ensure that development speeds up much more than it's happening at the moment? And what are our points of reference? I do apologize if I sound like I'm looking too externally for this discussion. But trust me, if we don't look externally for reference points and learn from the benchmarks, and Professor Lord mentioned some benchmarks, which I was quite excited about, those guide us in our development. How did South Africa deal with HIV problem? I just returned from Uganda. I went to a very prominent school in Uganda, and every corner of the school has got a sign and a message about HIV, telling the students that HIV is real, it can be prevented, and all sort of messages that bring hope and also solution to the problem in Uganda.
And so I believe... So for you, we must focus internally on our own strength and how we can at least manage these situations. We'll come to you again whilst we learn some education.
I agree.
But Blessed,
I fully agree.
Blessed and,
if we keep saying we need to focus on the internal solutions, I believe all the panelists, with due respect, will agree that we may not have the resources in proportion that is required to do it exclusively internally.
Right.
I do not.
You're with us for a while, but I'll come to my colleagues here in the studio, Blessed and Dennis. You recall just a while ago, antiretroviral medications came to this country and they were stuck in the pot because we're unable to clear them. And all of this will be a bigger picture in the funding and the help that we get in terms of medical health or maybe in the health sector. I have a question on that the NDC anticipates. Of course, they didn't anticipate that the US would be cutting a certain level of aid, and especially in 90 days, were unable to receive any form of funding. Did they anticipate certain things like this when they thought of rationalizing certain taxes? I mean, many have said that if you're going to be rationalizing COVID-19, the levy, if you're going to be scrapping betting tax and all of that, would you not wait? Because you can't pour from an empty cup. Would you not wait and then see what you have before you promise certain rationalization and scrapping as well? Dennis, in this 90 days and even beyond, because you cannot tell what the US aid will be coming up. And of course, it is Trump. It is Donald Trump. We wake up to every surprise every day. Dennis and listen, I am curious, what are some of the anticipations of this government? We have 59 so far. Are we now going to be borrowing when we're rationalizing some levies?
Well, I think that let's try to contextualize what is happening in the US very well. That even if the US aid had not been cut, this is a critical time for us to check our spending and live within our means. Whatever is happening in the US is sending a message across the world that aid is no longer a sustainable means of meeting your critical expenditure like healthcare. As a country, we should be able to look within our means, prioritize and rationalize our expenditure. If you look at our history of spending over the last decade, what you see is that we built a very expensive government machinery, spent a lot of money, but the domestic revenues were not enough to finance that, which led us to borrowing to finance our expenditure. And that has led us to where we are and depending more on external financing or external sources for some critical areas like health. What it cost us with this USAID action is just about $70 million. But if you look at some of the areas that we could cut, if we could address some of the procurement breaches, procurement abuse, and some reckless spending, and some state institutions that are not really delivering outcomes, if we can crop all of them out and prioritize and channel some of this spending into critical areas like healthcare, this is a message that is being sent across the entire world. Today, even the European Union is considering closing certain offices across the globe that may not be delivering certain results because it has become imperative for them to start reviewing and finding money to finance some of their own issues like internal security, economy. Countries like Germany are even considering expanding under their debt ceiling or even going out for money to deal with some domestic issues like security. The UK is doing the same. So what is happening in the US is sending a global message that it is about time countries start prioritizing, rationalizing the expenditure and living within their means and growing their domestic revenue. So for example, we have a lot of schemes that were happening within the country, making a lot of money. Look at SML. If SML had been expanded to the mineral sector, this company would have been making a lot beyond almost $50 million within a period of 50 million Ghana cedis within a year. These are monies that if you're able to cut all of those needless expenditure and channel them into critical areas like healthcare. We spent a lot of money on NAPCO. We spent a lot of money on NEIP. We spent a lot of money on USTAT. So there are a lot of wastage happening within our system that we need to fix. And it is clear within the IMF program that if we don't cut the waste and rationalize our spending, we'll come back to this same situation because $70 million for a country like us, we spend a lot of money on things that are not needed. It is about time we rationalize, prioritize, and cut the waste away, fix our procurement, and we can deal with some of these issues.
I couldn't, have agreed any more than what, Dennis is telling us now. And here's my observation generally about what's happening in the U.S. My belief is that it's not just about the U.S., right? It's becoming much more of an African problem, our side of the bargain. The situation where you see states going in for funding, aid from these developed countries, and yet there's no accountability on how we're utilizing all of these that's coming in from the U.S. And you find, of course, some former heads of states, the former Kenyan president, Uhuru Kenyatta, has spoken about why we should then be looking inwards and being more accountable on our own funds and what we generate internally. I recall Imani doing some extensive work on port governance, for instance. And Dennis, we had this conversation before on PM Express. The fact that you look at our port governance, which is so weak, a lot of loopholes, and it's unfortunately politicized again. I mean, tell us about that story, because that's crucial in this whole revenue mobilization story.
So I think that we have always, because we've relied so much on external financing to meet our domestic obligations, we never actually made effort to implement reforms at raising revenue. So over the last decade, averagely, our tax revenue has been averaging about 13% of GDP. If you look at our tax revenue potential of about 21%, we have not actually been taking the right effort to raise more money. And so that is why we always hit a snag, or we always hit a block when we have to finance our domestic obligations. Else, if we were actually living up to our expectations, and collecting all the revenues that needed to be collected, this wouldn't be a problem. And you cite the port issue, and it's a very critical case in point, where our research work was able to identify collusion between business people, stateside actors, and workers within our port sector, creating schemes for people to misclassify people to clear goods without paying, undervaluation, reclassification of goods, and even improper weighing of goods that lead to revenue loss. And so these are all areas that we need to plug, and the port is one. The port is a very huge revenue generation point for the government. The World Bank did an assessment somewhere in 2020 and realized that if you look at the port revenue potential of our country, in fact, we were not actually, in terms of the gap, import revenue gap was about 36%, which means that we have a significant revenue potential at the port. But because of a lot of loopholes within the port management system, within the port, and we have created this system where stateside actors, both security, excessive control of the political class over our port, then business people who are also trying to game the system, they are able to kind of manipulate a lot of activities within the port and create opportunities for people to misclassify, clear goods without paying the duties. Sure. And that is what is creating that sort of import revenue gap that we're seeing within our port. And so there is the need for us to plug all the leakages and the loopholes within our revenue mobilization space. Definitely, the government will be big on IT solutions, technology to raise revenue. This is not the first time we are doing that. There's been several instances that we've brought in revenue assurance system, but because we have not fixed the institutional gaps that allow these revenue leakages to happen, that is why we are unable to fix them. And so one example.
And for what I'm excited about is the aspect of the security, because port governance depends largely on national security. In fact, the president was speaking and touching on bits and strategies that will enhance our national security strategy. But we've not, of course, spoken extensively about how the sector, in terms of our security, is politicized. In fact, the change of every government, all of these critical infrastructure, you would see them, of course, some significant changes to their to the security installations there, or perhaps the individuals who are even at post there. So it's becoming much more a political matter, isn't it? I want to bring in Mukhtar Mouni. Mukhtar, who's Executive Director for the West Africa Center for Counter-Extremism. And Mukhtar, you just want to perhaps take off from port governance and then we move into security proper, because we're heavily dependent on imports. We're not raising the revenue. And it's because all of these security agencies or their agents assigned to these centers are becoming much more, and with all apology to security enforcement personnel, they're becoming a bit infiltrated by the politicians.
Well, of course, we know the importance of security as a campaign, policy of political parties. If we look at in the last 2 decades, it has been a key and important part of the discourse within politics and within governments. The issues of, vigilante violence and the issues of recruitment into the security services, including the national security as well as the police service in particular. And of course, this affects all the other security agencies that we have seen. And it's part of the huge conversations that we have had around it and the necessity to sanitize the security space and ensure that it becomes very professional, very relevant, and reflective of the security needs of the people in modern governance and democratic practice. We continue to see these elements as part of the security sector, and that continues to undermine professional policing and professional security. And I wish that this State of the Nation address would have captured the reality of the space and what measures would be put in place to address that. But beyond that, if you look at the space that in particular, where we operate, the issue of violent extremism and the issues of conflict, chieftaincy, ethnic, pervasive conflicts in many parts of the country. And I understand the initial stance and the moves that the president made upon his swearing in was to demonstrate how important the issues of ethnic and chieftaincy conflicts are to him. And that is why the first trip outside of the capital was to go to Boko to meet the two factions in this prolonged, unresolved chieftaincy conflict. And I expected that we would have seen snippets of that in the State of Nations address. From where I sit, chieftaincy and ethnic conflict is the single biggest source of fatalities in this country, apart from road accidents in our country. And so it's important that we capture that and elevate that to higher national level conversation and ensure that we put a stop to this prolonged, endless conflict that undermines all of us, our security. Those of us in the urban centers, especially in southern Ghana, may not appreciate the reality and the seriousness of the conflicts up north. If we consider our proximity, I mean the northern part, our proximity to the destabilized Sahelian region, it gives you a sense that one of the single biggest commitment you should have as a government is to commit to fighting the unresolved conflicts in that part of the country. And I was very pleased that the president appointed a special envoy to the Sahel to deal with the crisis there, because the long-term consequences or reality in our context in coastal states is that we are not safe if the Sahelian states are not safe. And so it's important that we commit long-term to dealing with the crisis to guarantee our security and safety here. And so hopefully further conversations would unearth what government plans to do around it.
And I like that you have indicated that further conversations, especially because in January, the ex-president, when he was leaving his last State of the Nation's address, he indicated that he touted his success really in resolving the Dagbon dispute, and also indicated that the Boko dispute remains unresolved. And you also actually reminded us how the president's first trip outside of Accra was to go to Boko to really reiterate his commitment to solving such disputes. And so I also looked out for that, some bits of that in the State of the Nation's address. But I don't know if you can touch more on the borders, especially because, again, I refer to the last State of the Nation's address. The president touted that the borders are safe and sound. I will take your word. As of now, are they safe and sound? I didn't hear that in the State of the Nation's address, but can you give us some assurances?
Well, border security has always been a big problem, and it continues to be a big problem, especially when it comes to security from external sources. We say that security measures are a function of our threat perception. Your perception of it will lead you to certain measures. Here in Ghana, when we talk about our exposure to terrorism or violent extremism, we are often focusing on borders because our perception is that the threat is from external sources. And so we're looking at a lot of issues. So you often will hear we have porous borders, we have unmanned borders and all of that. Yes, it's a reality and it continues to be a reality. I have seen or have noticed significant focus on borders and measures that have been put in place, including physical, infrastructure measures, deployment of hardware, equipment, and plants around the borders. But in my professional assessment, we still have huge challenges along the borders. If you look at the key entry points in the northern part of the country, Paga, for instance, which is for both vehicular and human traffic, it still leaves much to be desired. We don't have, even metal detectors and security systems that allow for electronic, assessment of individuals and goods coming in and out of this space. And that is very key. That is very important. If you go to Hamile, you see very little in terms of what modern day border management process should be. And so we need to do a lot in terms of border security management. When we talk about porosity, we are not talking about only physical porosity, the absence of manned individuals at the borders. We're also talking about porosity in terms of the capacity to, for officials to be complicit in activities. And that's about corruption, that is about smuggling, that is about being, compromising on practices that allow unwarranted goods and individuals in this space. So there's a lot. And I mean, I've seen a lot being done, but there's still a lot to be done in that space. And I think that going forward, it should be part of the conversations that will unearth what we should be doing to secure this country from external threats.
Well, Blessed, I just want to take your thoughts on this. Do you think really that political figures who become government leaders or who form government are potentially able to resolve very tribal disputes, such as what we see?
It's been part of the argument for the NPP side that's why John Dramani Mahama, the president, ought to focus on perhaps giving a standalone chieftaincy ministry. That was the argument advanced by President Akufo-Addo, a reason for which we had a standalone chieftaincy ministry. But in this case, you find chieftaincy being tied in religious affairs, being tied to the local government ministry, well, as part of the cost-cutting measure. So that indeed is piling more pressure on Ahmed Ibrahim as the sector minister now to try and do a lot more in resolving the matters. But clearly, you see that you need a multifaceted approach in dealing with these matters. We're told that the revered Otunfo has been involved in some more of these disputes. We've seen pictures of the defense minister, for instance, engaging him in just the last few weeks. So that gives us a sense broadly of how this new government would want to use perhaps a cost-cutting measure whilst focusing on a multifaceted approach in dealing with the chieftaincy dispute that we're seeing. But Dennis, the point also, okay, right. Mukhtar, you want to pick up on that as well? Because that's what I've seen over the period. Yeah.
Yes, I appreciate the point you're making about having a standalone chieftaincy ministry. And it's key because structures are important in dealing with issues. But there are many other layers or other things that undermine our capacity to resolve this chieftaincy crisis all over or many parts of the country. I think that the single biggest challenge in dealing with the chieftaincy crisis is the issue of politics. The politicization is a big thing. It's a big thing in a way that I may not be able to state on this platform. And anyone involved, state and non-state actors in the chieftaincy crisis all over the country, knows very well the role, the destabilizing role politics has played in this crisis. And so one of the preconditions in dealing with this crisis would have to be depoliticizing engagement in the chieftaincy.
Yeah, it's just unfortunate that in the whole equation when it comes to security, you can't act without the state, right? So that's when the challenge will come up. You still need the political actors acting on behalf of the state to then give the orders.
Politicians can act in situations without necessarily being political. If you look at the lens from a more nationalistic point of view, whatever issue it is, people can actually tell whether you are being political or not. We see in the north part, you look at the chieftaincy violence in the Boko area, and we've seen many activities and many moves taken by the state, and nearly every one of them appears to be read with a political lens. And some of them clearly can, you would see some political leanings in those decisions, and others that are not. And yet, of course, people can always resort to politicization as a factor or basis for anything. But if you are being political, people can tell, irrespective of whether you are the president or a political appointee or not. And so it's important that we are very, very honest about the way we deal with these things and ensure that we take away politics. We cannot take away politics completely, but we have to reduce the tendency to take decisions along political lines. Other than that, we undermine goodwill and support.
We wait to see what the outcome will be. But I'm interested in hearing from Austin Game because we need to go. Yet I want your
on that 10%.
Indeed,
yeah,
indeed,
on that
10%.
Just so you clear your throat, let me pick up from here for you.
10%.
Yes,
10%. Yeah.
10%. That base pay. We really
but
cannot.
If I clear my throat on 10%, Labour would cover me right now.
I agree with you. But I am of the view that you really cannot pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
And I get the sense, even from today's State of the Nation's address, Mr. Game, that really we don't have the resources. And of course, we're part of the Labour, we're Labour force. 10%, we even want more. My father will probably be watching that. What's this girl saying? But at this time, is it something we can sustain?
So you don't want 10%? I want more than 10% anyway. And Dennis would obviously want more than 10%. We all want more than 10%, isn't it?
You had me clearing my throat. This issue, but before I get there, let me talk about this conflict resolution thing you are talking about. Because that's why I dwell even better. Unfortunately, we talk too much in Ghana here. We are not looking for professionals to assist in the resolution of disputes like this. Everybody is trying to just muddy the waters, and we want to put it on the doorsteps of politicians and so forth and so on. And the people fighting. The point is that do the people of Boku want solution to their problem? That's number one. If they want solution to their problem, I guarantee you it should not take more than 2 weeks to resolve that matter. I repeat, the people involved in the conflict in Boku, the two sides, do they want solution to the problem that has bedeviled them all these years? Mediation is the way to go. It's not even about arbitration. It's not about court system, because it will only polarize them the more. A civilized way in resolving any chieftaincy, land, otherwise dispute is by mediation. And it's a civilized way anybody can use to do that. I wish the revered chief, Asante and his team well. We are available. If they need help, we are available to assist. But Boku issue is resolvable. It should not take more than 2 weeks. And if, for instance, those who have been assigned the responsibility, they are doing real professional mediation. Who is a politician in this matter? It's not regarded. It's put aside. It is the people who have the concern and are worried about that will appear before the panel, and they will be able to answer their own distance. They want to resolve that. They want to live in peace.
Okay.
They are fatigued.
Yeah.
Their children are dying. Their wives are being raped. So many people are in trouble. People cannot even travel to the north. So I think that we must see these things as just a burdensome stone we have imposed upon ourselves all these years. Is a resolvable matter.
Unfortunately, we've been bailed out.
Yes,
looks like this is just a start of a bigger conversation to follow through throughout the weekend and the days to come. But grateful, Austin Gami, for spending some time with us, and also to you, Dennis, and MFA would of course do the honors afterwards. I guess.
Well, I know, listen, thank you for joining me here today. But the conversation continues on The Pulse with Elton Bobry.